julep, pop, 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 julep, pop, 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 julep, pop, 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 woo!
All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Effing Growth. Today, we're on episode 48, so we're almost at the half a century mark. You know, 100's a big milestone for us we've been talking about, but 48. Let's see how many we can get through this year. Last week, we talked all about, is WordPress scared of Webflow? We talked a little bit about open source versus closed source. But since we did the Webflow resolutions, that episode was kind of small. We only had 30 minutes to kind of get into some of this, and it became a really interesting conversation. We actually got a response from Matt Mullenweg, who, as we'll explain, is the CEO of Automattic, which is the company behind WordPress.com. We got other engagement from people in the WordPress community, and so we just wanted to dive into this and discuss a little bit about open source versus closed source. So we're going to dive deep into all that today, whether you should use WordPress, Webflow, should you be worried? But before we get too far into this thing, let's up and grow. Okay, what is going on, Joe? What is going on?
What's up? I'm ready for the part 2 of this conversation. Like you said, cut short because we had so many great Webflow resolutions. And yeah, I'm ready to pick this one back up. There's a lot more to talk about on this. And I want to make it clear that this is not necessarily for you as the listener picking between one or the other platform. If you're already up in Webflow and you are sold on Webflow, this can help you communicate why others should be using Webflow. In the sales process, if people are saying, well, do I go WordPress? Do I go Webflow? This content in this episode is going to help you explain why one may choose one option or the other option. Really powerful.
Nice. Yeah, and there's so much to talk about. But before we do that real quick, let's say what's up to everybody who's in the chat with us here. So let's jump over to the chat real quick. Let's see. Carly letting us know they'll be a little late, but they'll be here. Susan McPhee is saying this is a bold topic. I like it. We do too. We're excited to talk about this one. Vibor is saying really excited about this one as a freelance developer who uses multiple solutions to provide results. So there may be some of you who are not Webflow exclusive. That's very common in the freelance space, right? For a long time, I was kind of dabbling in both worlds. Right, I was doing a little bit of WordPress and doing a little bit of Webflow, and that all changed when I joined Finsweet. Obviously, went all in on Webflow here, but yeah, that's a very common situation is for people to be using different platforms, especially if your clients kind of demand that. So Babis is in the house. What's up, Babis? Nick Jones is here. What's up, Nick Jones? Christopher Coleman in the house. Michael Rose is here. Magdalena, what's up, Magdalena? Ezekiel Rochat in the house. What's up, Ezekiel? Fernando, Pablo's here. Aditya, Joel Whitaker, Vimalan, Flip Back. WordPress has Oxygen Builder, Page Builder that is Webflow for WordPress. Very similar. False, but it's close. I do agree. Oxygen is very close. It has some of the functionality. It is not Webflow for WordPress, but it is. They're getting there. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about the pros of these page builders. So Felix is here. What's up? Melissa, Kayla, Gabe Perez, August is here from Sweden. DTF fan mem. Hello guys. Thank you for all your content. What's up, everybody? Okay, we're gonna get right into this. Joe, opening thoughts. Do we have a little disclaimer today? Oh, you know what? We have a couple announcements too, I think, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do.
Announce it up.
Announcements, huh?
First announcement, I'll get it started with the client first template number 8. This is a new template that we have released under the client first system. And this is free, available for your use. It's based on a podcast template, but you can remix it, do whatever you want to make it your own. So we just released that. Go to finsweet.com/client-first/template/8. And that's in our resources center.
Nice. And yeah, there's a ton. Obviously, there's 8 other templates there.
Yeah.
We'll continue to release more. But there's also templates. There's a showcase there. There's people from the community. For instance, Maria created this Webflow website page announcement. She created a little clonable here. I actually don't have it. Oh no, give me 1 second. I can pull it up on this other screen. Actually, I don't have it. Let me see right here. I just want to share this. Boom. Let's open this and bring it over here. Please don't freeze computer, and then we'll go into this view. Okay, yeah, so Maria did a nice little template here. You can check that out. Give her some love. Leave a like for that. I'm not logged in, but I did leave a like and a little comment there. So yeah, check it out. Community's doing all sorts of stuff. Make sure you submit your stuff to the showcase, to the client first showcase. If you go to Finsweet, I can't spell while people are watching me. I always do that every time I type. I'm like lightning fast until like I'm watching or there's some, it's like quantum physics of typing. The people watching affect my ability to type. So all those resources are here. Go and check those out. There's a ton of Client First resources. Client First is catching a lot of steam in the community. If you haven't been watching that, there's a lot of talk about this, and we're working on some documentation. We'll talk a little bit later, comparing some of the responsive engines. We did a deep dive last week on that. We're going to do another deep dive on this Client First responsive engine this week because we had some stream hiccups last week, and so we want to clean that up and kind of redo that. So stay tuned Thursday. That's what we're going to stream all about. The other final little thing that I wanted to mention, which was kind of cool, the awards website is powered by Webflow. So if you have not seen this website, it's a stunning web design. And here you can see at the bottom, it's presented by Webflow. So it's like a joint little marketing thing. Cool to see this playing out. I think I saw a tweet from Bryant Chu the other day that said something like, we used to hope that someday people on awards would be winning sites building in Webflow, and now awards themselves is building their awards sites in Webflow. Super cool. That has to be an amazing feeling for them. So kudos to Webflow for that accomplishment. As always, like the video and subscribe, and that really helps us get to it. But let's get into these disclaimers, Joe. Let's jump right in. I'll actually take the first one because I want to make sure we don't dismiss, let me go back to this view. I want to make sure we don't dismiss the power of WordPress here, right? Webflow is like a little fly flying around the tail of the elephant in a room. Okay, so WordPress is the elephant in the room, right? They are 40% of the open web. And so let's not be mistaken at any part of this, about that, right? We don't want to dismiss the power of this platform or what it has done for the world of web development as a whole, right? Since WordPress started, it was the OG platform for blogging and getting this stuff kind of going. It's evolved for sure. I think some of those legacy problems are what's making it hard for it to keep up, but I don't want to dismiss the power of WordPress, how many people use it. We are obviously all in on Webflow. You all may be watching this all in on Webflow as well, but let's not just pretend that, WordPress is just a done deal. They grew, if you watched last week's episode, by 2 Wixes last year is how Matt Mullenweg put it. And so they are still growing market share. And so for those who want to think like it's not happening, let's just keep that in mind as we go through this. Joe, any thoughts on that disclaimer?
Yeah, that is, it really gets a lot of respect from me. Even though I am not a WordPress user, even though I'm about to talk about how much I don't like WordPress, it has my respect. Having this many people on the platform, having a vast community like this is excellent. So I'm going to be talking on the more negative side about it as a Webflow user, but my respect. And the next disclaimer is people defend WordPress like we defend Webflow. This is inherent in people taking sides. You know one platform better, you agree with one platform more, so you take that side. And this doesn't make anybody right or wrong. This is not, we're right for saying this in Webflow, or someone else is saying it's right in WordPress. These are two different opinions. There is no right or wrong. This is just really our opinions. So that's a big important disclaimer. These are not really facts. Some of them are facts, but a lot of it is opinion based. It's what we think is going to happen.
Yeah, and I also want to add a little bit onto that I think the fact that people are so defensive comes back to the point that they are a little bit worried. right? There's like in general, I think they are a little bit worried, which is what led me to the recap of the last stream. If you didn't watch, go to the last stream. I think about 30 minutes in, you'll see we played a little snippet of the State of the Word Address by Matt Mullenweg. And the State of the Word Address, if you're not familiar with it, is an annual event where Matt addresses the entire audience. And Matt, for anybody who doesn't know, let's pull this up real quick. He's let's see, founding developer of WordPress, the open source software used by over 40% of the web, including this site. Let's see. This is where I wanted to get to. So right here, he founded a company called Automattic, which is the force behind WordPress.com, Jetpack, WooCommerce, Simplenote, Longreads, I don't know what this one is, and a number of other products. So this is a heck of a guy, and to be honest, to have him respond to this means, in my mind, he is a little bit worried. When I watched this video that we played last week, that little 2-minute segment, I recognized that it wasn't like panic fear, right? It wasn't like, oh my God, they're gonna take us next week. It was, hey, these proprietary companies are stealing market share from open source platforms. I believe highly in open source platforms. This is me as Matt Mullenweg. And so he was worried about that, right? He's worried about the openness of the web. And I agree, there's part of this that is relevant as it relates to, what Facebook's doing, what Google is doing, what some of these companies are doing. And so good points, right? The smart guy, Matt Mullenweg is a smart guy. It was just interesting that he responded to that tweet. We had a little conversation back and forth, and it's going to become a stated goal of mine to get both he and Vlad in a conversation. I don't know if it's going to take us 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever, to make that happen. Maybe 6 months, whatever. But that's going to be a goal, is to kind of make that conversation happen, because they both have such similar visions for the web about empowering people to build and to create things for the web. But they're both going about it in two different ways, and I just thought that was interesting. Joe, any thoughts on him responding, getting attention from that WordPress world? What does that mean to you? Thoughts on that?
I thought it was super cool. You sent it over to me, and I saw it, and I got so excited because he is a big deal. He is a legend for a lot of what powers the web. So yeah, he has my complete respect. And just the fact of him responding on something that we were a part of felt really good. So yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, it was super cool. I wanted to bring it up. Let me see if I can pull the tweet here. Okay, I go, is WordPress scared of Webflow? This was the original tweet last week. He goes, nope, initially, and probably thought, oh, that's maybe a little too quick or short a quippy answer, because that's his personality. He goes, it does seem like a thoughtful product built by people who really care. It's just playing a completely different game. And this is what I want to talk a little bit about, because I asked him, is this the first time you're seeing Webflow? I was a WordPress user for 7 years. I actually met him at WordCamp, so I sent him a picture in the DM of he and I meeting, and wondering what he means about playing a different game. And he answers, I've tracked it since 2014. Different game, short-term and long-term incentives, economic structure. And then he recommends this book, which I actually started reading. This book, Finite and Infinite Games. And it's interesting. I don't want to dive too deep into it right now, because I'm just kind of digesting it. But I think his claim here is that WordPress is building an infinite game. And in the context of an infinite game, the infinite game is a game whose only rules are to keep playing the game, right? And this is, I think, what he means behind open source, is that the rules of an infinite game are essentially to just make sure the game keeps being played and that more people can come play the game. And what they describe as a finite game is something that's bound by rules, times, place, and numbers, amongst other things, and there's an expected outcome, right? So somebody wins a finite game, nobody can win an infinite game. And so this battle between open source and closed source, I think he sees as a finite versus infinite game. And I'll be interested to read more of that book and see what he's really thinking and talking about in that context. But I'll reference that, and I think I'll point out a couple times throughout the episode where I disagree with some of those analogies. But Joe, any thoughts before we just get into some of this? I do want to ask the question, is Webflow playing an infinite game or a finite game? It is a closed source platform, but I know Vlad's strategy is to build a 100-year legacy business. So thoughts here as we talk about this, as we just kind of set the stage for what's coming, what's going through your head right now?
This will be an interesting topic. I love the finite versus infinite comparison here. I don't think I agree with it in terms of Webflow. At least I hope. I hope that's not the case. It's interesting to call WordPress infinite because the model may be infinite, but the actual platform, the software behind it, may not be infinite. Just like we're seeing a lot of movement away from PHP. We have a platform built in PHP. Just because it's the most popular platform doesn't mean it's going to be there forever, even if it plans to be there forever
Yeah.
through open source. So we'll get more into that. Let's jump right into the topics.
Yeah,
here.
let's get into the nuts of it. That kind of sets the stage. That's what happened last week. We just wanted to kind of recap that for anybody who missed it. And now we can kind of get into the crux of what's happening with this. And keep your comments coming. I'm seeing the comments coming heavy on the site here. We'll go through these, but there's a lot to get through today. So let's kind of jump into this a little bit. And let's get into the pros and cons of open source versus closed source. So first, we're going to get into pros and cons of open source. Joe, you want to take the pros on open source?
Sure. Open source, a pro. This is usually the most cost-effective option to implement. It's open source. There is not necessarily revenue and profit behind this, and it's usually less expensive. And that is the case many times with WordPress. Another pro, usually fairly stable. That this is a community effort that a lot of people are contributing to. There's a lot of people that help make WordPress better and better daily. So for that reason, it's usually fairly stable.
Yeah.
Raymmar, anything to add to that?
No, did you get through the whole list? I'm sorry, I was pulling it up on the screen
No.
so people could kind of follow up with the list here a little bit. I'm going to see if we can just
Yeah,
use
I
our
just
notes.
sure. I just got the first two. So another pro of open source, we are scalable. We had some scalability issues with closed platforms. You can only do what is available in the platform, where WordPress, much more scalable for a lot of use cases. Another pro, you own the entire stack from top to bottom. We talked about community-led development and the freedom to do with it what you want. This is a big one. I think this is a leading passion point behind a lot of WordPress users, that they have the freedom to do what they want with it.
Yeah. And not just the freedom to do what you want, but to take it where you want. One of their biggest, and if you look back on the, not only did Matt Mullenweg reply to the tweet, he left a comment on the YouTube channel, and he took issue with one of the points we made about calling some of the hosting platforms closed source, because even if one of those hosting platforms closes down, you could move the code theoretically to a new hosting platform. And his point was that that's kind of what makes it open. Again, I agree. I tend to agree with some of that, but the proprietary nature of a lot of these hosting platforms and a lot of the stuff that's released with a GPL with what they call a combined license is also proprietary. So, even though some of these things are open source, they're not always fully open. What was the other one? The community-led development. This is something we get into with Webflow here, right? Where we wish, maybe sometimes Webflow was following what the community said, hey, build this, rather than they have their priorities. And so going into, if the pro is the community-led development, the con is that then sometimes you can't or are not going to get the features that you want because you can't build them, right? So the 10,000 item limit for Webflow CMS is an example of this here, right? And so cons with open source. Let's go through some of the cons here. They're not always user-friendly, right? If it's open source software, let's say Linux or something like that, you kind of have to know what you're doing in order to actually manipulate that. There's a lot higher technical hurdle to get into that. It's kind of the opposite of what no code strives to be, which is, technically friendly to folks. And so there's also tons of security vulnerabilities. When something is open source and it becomes prolific, then that means lots of people want to go and figure out how they can exploit this technology. And so it creates a ton of security vulnerabilities, and it becomes hard to monetize, right? Like, think about the amount of businesses that are built on top of Linux or even the ecosystem of WordPress. And Automattic has claimed a big part of that with the WordPress.com. but it's hard to monetize an open source platform because typically the license requires that the work you do behind it also be released as open source, right? That's part of the open source license. So you can't take something that's open source, wrap your own thing around it, and then go sell that 100% proprietary. Parts of that need to be open source, which creates conflict. And so it becomes difficult to monetize some of these open source tools. And the openness of the community, I think one of the things we talk about here in Webflow is that the community is super open and super friendly. I think that's a function of being really early in this community. The WordPress community was like that 7, 8, 9 years ago. Now there's huge tension in the WordPress community because certain people want to see things a certain way, because developers go one direction and these guys go another direction. And so you start seeing these rifts and divisions in the community. It's what's going to happen as the community grows and scales. I warn about that. It's coming for this no-code community as well. And so just know that while the pro of community-led development is one thing, the ability from top down to make those technical decisions is also super important, because it means there's less technical debt, right? And so let's talk a little bit. Let's jump to closed source now. Let's go pros and cons on closed source. Do you want to start at the top of the list here, Joe?
Sure. Let's bring up that list so people can follow.
Oh, yeah. Let's go to closed source here.
We have closed source, a pro of closed source. Easy to maintain. As we know in Webflow, when we build the site, there's really not much we have to do after we launch it. There are no things to update. It's just easy to maintain. We get premium hosting. This is included with the package. This is a big win. We don't have to worry about this. Closed Source Pro, performance optimizations. These come automatically. We don't have to worry about these. This is coming with Webflow. Like, they just released the designer upgrade. We now have a more powerful designer. We don't have to touch anything.
Yeah. And this
usually
is,
offers,
hang on, because I want to jump in on the closed source thing when it comes to performance and optimizations. It's something that's just impossible to do with open source because, again, there's no top down. We're doing this, right? And so, again, that means sometimes you don't get exactly what you're looking for, but it does mean you have the refinement of the product quality. We compare the Apple iTunes, the App Store, to like Android, the Play Store, where you could load any app you want on your Android device, and you hear stories all the time about how an app is manipulating the data on your phone. It's tracking you. It's doing something that it shouldn't be doing. It's accessing other things. That doesn't happen as much in the iOS environment because Apple kind of scrubs some of that stuff. And so that's what we mean here by performance optimizations, right? Because it's kind of that closed system, things are made to work together. It's that ecosystem effect that people talk about with Apple, where your iPhone works well with the laptop, which works well with the TV, which works well with the iPad, and all that stuff working together creates that, and it's able to perform better. You're controlling the hardware. Right? This is what Steve Jobs always knew, is that if you could control the hardware, the software becomes a lot easier. Whereas with open source, you're often connecting a lot of disparate pieces, and that can create, some issues, right? And so that's where that performance optimization comes. And we didn't mention this before as a con of I think we skipped over that, but the centralized support, whereas with closed source systems, you usually get support. So Joe, I'll let you keep on that list there. I just wanted to say the piece on that performance thing.
Sure. They usually offer support. You're talking about these potential issues happening. Webflow offers the support, sometimes automated. Sometimes you just get an email and they say, hey, something's happening. We're fixing it now. Or you can write to them and you can get a real person responding to you that works at the platform to answer your question. Yeah. That's important for a lot of people. That goes with the regular updates. We talked about this. This all is easier to monetize. We're paying a premium for this. This is a service. And because we're paying a premium, they get to build out all of these things. They get to build out improved interfaces. They get to build out the support team. They get to build out all these different things that make the company better and better. And all because of that, I think it's easier to update. Like you were talking about, there's a central decision and that gets dispersed down.
Yeah.
When you have that, things just move quicker. When there's less levels and less things to happen to make that update, it's going to happen.
Yeah. That does lead to some of the cons here. And I want to bring up this comment from ours who says there might be a fear that Webflow prices skyrocket and you cannot escape quickly. Correct. Cons is that the cost can be an issue, right? Whereas open source is very cost effective. Usually you don't have to pay for the source code itself. With the proprietary platforms, you often do. There's that cost associated with that proprietary technology, right? And this is what people charge for. This is where, again, it becomes easier to monetize a closed source platform because of this. So now you're locked into that platform, right? This is what people worried about with like Dreamweaver or Adobe Muse, or this is what people worry about with Webflow. I worried about this early on. More and more is like, what happens if the platform disappears tomorrow? Well, those are not those concerns, I think, have been alleviated, especially with the funding. This gets back into the finite game, because what if Webflow sells to Adobe, right? What if some crazy offer gets made? And, I know Vlad talks about, hey, this is not our goal. But then we asked him, yeah, but what if somebody makes you some obnoxious offer of $2 billion? Like, are you going to walk away from that? And, he's like, there was not a, hey, it's not a clear no. And I think this is where, if you go to our poll, where we're asking, should you be worried about, Webflow not being open source? Leave your thoughts on that. I'm a little worried is at 33% right now. I'm not worried at all. It's at 64%. And I'm very worried is at 3%. Joe, let's go through the rest of these cons. And I see a bunch of comments. I kind of want to jump into the comments for a second. I know we've covered a lot.
Sure. Comment.
Yeah. Okay. So no freedom to modify the code base. Whereas the pro on the open source side, you can do whatever you want with it. On the closed source side, obviously you can't. However, that's not always true. And this is where I think Webflow makes a little bit of a difference here. And this is where the lines between the infinite versus the finite game begin to get blurred, is that you do see that you can make additions with a platform, because we're doing it. Right? Finsweet is building on top of Webflow, which is a closed source platform, which again gets me back into that, like, is Webflow open sourcing another aspect, which is the actual building of the software, rather than the technology that allows you to build that software? I don't know that that's the case, because again, the platform is locked down, and the more they build these features, the more it'll be kind of based on their hosting. But it's just a thought, right? You can build on top of Webflow, whereas most closed source platforms, you cannot, right? Facebook, you're stuck using Facebook. HubSpot, they have plugins and integrations, but you're stuck using it as it is. Whereas again, with WordPress, you can do most of whatever you want. You've also got data collection and forced upsells, right? So maybe there's calls to action that they're always triggering you. Maybe if you want to add another user, it's going to cost you more money. All of these things become hurdles to closed source platforms. And you have no control over updates or roadmaps, which we've all identified as being a big issue with Webflow, which is why we build some of the products we do. And you can also not pass on that source code as a derivative product. Whereas I can take Webflow and I could fork Webflow entirely if I wanted and start my own blogging platform using their core as the backbone. As long as I made that open source, it would be fine. Actually, WordPress started in that same context, right? It started as a B2 platform. Matt Mullenweg turned it into WordPress, opened that up, and the rest is history. And so you cannot carry on the closed source code into another project that you want to sell then. So those are kind of the pros and cons of open and closed source. Now let's get into a little bit of these comments here, Joe. You seeing anything interesting that you want to go, or should we just go to the top here?
Let's go to the top. I saw a comment about a WordPress developer leaving. There's a comment that they had 5 plugins, the developer left, and now they have no support. Do you see that one?
Who made it? Do you remember? I have 5. There it goes. I have 5 WordPress websites using the same plugin. This is Nick Jones. Plugin dev just vanished. No support, no updates. Welcome to WordPress. This happens all the time.
Yeah. It almost makes me feel like when you're using plugins, you have different service providers. Even if it's a simple plugin to do a slider, or a plugin to do some thing that's not really important, but still fueling some part of your site. This is dangerous, having all these providers. And we see this in the no-code world too. We don't want to ship a site with 6 different integrations. We want the least amount of integrations as possible. And really, when you're using WordPress, every plugin I'm looking at as an integration, as something that needs to be managed, as something that we hope nobody disappears on, that we hope they stay updated with modern web principles. So yeah, this is really unfortunate, Nick. And this is one of the core reasons a lot of people leave the WordPress platform.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember I'd have builds with 20, 30 plugins on it, and they always say like, oh, you shouldn't have more than X number of plugins on your site. And it's like, okay, that's a good rule of thumb, but I need this functionality or I need this other thing over here. And the only way to do that is with a plugin, And so like the other thing is that sometimes a plugin that you just want to do something simple ends up causing a lot more issues, right? Like the plugin that you use opens up to other vulnerabilities. And anyway, yeah, Nick Jones follows up here. He says, I want so many plants in the background. The stream just looks like you're sitting in a bush. So people noticing the greenery behind you there. Let's see. I want to look at some of these other ones. Ezekiel saying there's a difference between market shareholder, users and websites, and market leader. Think Android versus Apple. Respect where respect is due 100%. Yeah, I think that's a good analogy, is that Android versus iOS, because it's kind of what we're going to be looking at here once Webflow opens up the iOS store. I always make the reference about Webflow being iOS before the App Store, right? And BlackBerry is, WordPress is like the BlackBerry of that. I don't think Webflow comes in and kills BlackBerry like iOS did to the App Store, but I do think they come in and steal a significant part of that market share, and then you end up with Android versus iOS rather than like BlackBerry in that instance. But I think it's going to come onto the scene like it did with, with iOS when they open up that App Store. Let's see. Let's see what else is coming in here. Watching this while translating WordPress sites to Webflow. Attributes. Okay, thanks, Dave. Penny saying the fear with a closed source platform is that things can change outside the control of people who rely on it. For sure. If Webflow decides to be less democratic or focuses more on enterprise and smaller users, things could look quite differently. This is a major fear with closed source platforms. Censorship is a fear. What if they don't let certain people build websites? What if one day they turned off, somebody's Webflow account? Like these things, sure. You can't do that with WordPress, right? Like Automattic, Matt Mullenweg, nobody can turn that off. That it becomes, something to think about, right? In the context of what you're building. So Penny, good point there. Pablo Cortez, the thing is, though, Webflow shows you all the elements of CSS and HTML. So even if Webflow decides to close one day, not likely, Webflow users are ready to keep on building on, let's say, VS Code. Joe, thoughts there?
Well, yes, you can export the site, but that's not really why you build in Webflow. I think a lot of people would be very unhappy if they were just left with a zip of their files. That's not an ideal situation. So, hello, am I still here?
Crap. Sorry, Joe, I lost your audio on my end. Give me 1 second here.
Okay. I'm going to reload this.
This is my fault. I clicked the wrong button here. The crowd can still hear you, Joe. However, it's not a fault on your end. Uh-oh. Now we lost Joe. There, he's back. Okay. Okay, do we have your audio, Joe?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. We're back. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Good.
Nope. That's just my fault. I closed the wrong tab. I was just telling Joe I have like so many tabs and like screens open here. There's like, every step is a booby trap. Okay. I'm sorry. What were you saying there, Joe?
I was saying that this can happen, but this is not an ideal situation. This, I think, a lot of people would be unhappy with just receiving a zip of their HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I don't really see this as open source or being able to truly translate your project to something else, because we build in Webflow to build in Webflow.
Yeah.
It's not really made to go elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the big concern, especially because of the hosting, and as they add more functionality, you can take the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and export the code, but you can't export the functionality of the CMS, right? And I think this is where the lock-in happens.
Yes,
right. This is where the risk does come. Let's take a look at the poll. Where are we sitting on this poll? Okay, 31% is a little worried, 66% is not worried, and then 3% is very worried. And so we'll just keep an eye on that. Feel free to leave your thoughts on the poll there. Webflow should decrease its prices is a comment there. Let's see. Mirella is saying there are open source projects led by big companies such as Microsoft where they still make the main decisions on those projects. Not sure how if this approach would work for Webflow though. This is a point to be made with WordPress though. WordPress is open source. However, the largest user of WordPress is Automattic, which powers WordPress.com. There's WordPress.org. That's the free open source software. And then there's WordPress.com. WordPress.com is the managed hosted version of WordPress.org. So Automattic, the company, has taken this open source tool and built a business around hosting technology that at some level is proprietary, right? That they're running a big multi-site. It's the largest WordPress multi-site, and I don't have the time to go into what that actually means, but they're sharing some tools in there that, you know, they're baking in their cake that they charge money for. Not only that, but this whole Gutenberg thing, if you watch that State of the Word address that Matt Mullenweg made that started this episode last week, they're talking about this Gutenberg block editor, which is a big transition they made as a response to how Squarespace and Wix and all of these other visual editors were bringing tools out that WordPress couldn't compete with. There was a time there where WordPress, their editor visually was looking really janky compared to a Squarespace and a Wix, and that's where people started flocking to those categories. And so WordPress, at the behest of Automattic, with the leadership of Automattic, goes and builds this Gutenberg plugin thing that now has the community up in arms, right? I think we could, I don't want to jump to the accessibility thing, but there's a big rift in the WordPress community because of decisions like this. So Morella is bringing a really good point here. I don't know how this happens at Webflow because they're not open source, but they do make those top-down decisions. You know, for instance, people want a 10,000 CMS item limit lifted, but they're focused on other stuff. I'm sure they'll get there eventually, but, you know, anyway, I digress. Joe, any thoughts that I triggered there before we move on to more comments?
Let's move on. Yeah.
Babis is saying open source might be cost effective, but most website owners will still end up paying monthly fees for things like sliders, modals, etc. These things add up, and you might realize that Webflow setup ends up being cheaper. Yes.
Could be.
Nickeled and dimed to death on WordPress. Now, again, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. When Webflow opens up the plugin marketplace, you will likely have to pay for all the plugins, right? Yeah. So like, this is just one of those things that doesn't exist because it doesn't exist yet. So eventually this kind of thing will happen in Webflow as well. You'll have those locked in costs, those recurring monthly costs. But this goes against the open source debate because, again, I think that the more of those services you have integrated, the less open source that becomes. In principle, it's still open source, but in practice, it becomes like hard to define that as open source for things like we've already described. Automattic pushing this Gutenberg block thing on everyone, you know, the hosting infrastructure, the different plugins. And so, yeah, if you're super technical, if you're a developer, a WordPress pro, a PHP expert, then yes, open source matters to you because you can go into your garage and stand up a server and do the thing. But if you're just us, if you're just the average person, like all of that stuff is so far out of what you want to do to get a website up that you don't really care about that. And for all intents and purposes in the real world, practically, the open source thing doesn't matter in that instance because you're still relying on all of this underlying technology to make it usable for you. And that's what matters. That's what makes this important. Any thoughts on that, Joe?
Yes. As you have more of these plugins and as you have more of these paid add-ons in WordPress, your site becomes much more difficult to rebuild or make edits to. Right? This is a fact. You have 30 plugins on your project. If you want to rebuild that, it's just more work. It's more difficult. You want to edit it, you're prone to more issues. When a Webflow type marketplace releases, when you have 30 plugins, I think it's going to be a different experience because it is closed source. They're going to manage it very closely, just like Apple managing much more closely their app store. So you'll see a higher quality, you'll see much more integration into the platform. And yeah, you know, that I totally agree with you that all of those plugins, in practice, it's not open source because you're using all of these things on your website. All of your whole website is being powered by not open source.
Yeah. Yeah. Flipback is bringing up a good point here about differences. This is
Yep.
what you're going to get, right? Like, this is what we're talking, like, there's certain things. Webflow's not there yet with e-commerce. WooCommerce is one of the biggest e-commerce platforms on the market, right? After Shopify or with Shopify. I don't know what the numbers are there specifically, but they're both big players in the e-commerce space. Webflow just started with e-commerce, so give it time. A lot of this is going to take some time. A lot of this is going to take some time to play out, right? We're really
Yes.
early on all of
Yes.
this, Did I overlook anything there, Joe? Are we, let's see, security is a little bit of a concern. My own ignorance on the topic definitely plays a part here. Yeah, WordPress, you hear about it at least once a quarter, right? Some big vulnerability, some plugin did something, something or other, took advantage of all these different sites. And now not only is your site compromised, but all your users' data is compromised as well. And yeah, that's a big issue that you don't need to worry about with Webflow. Will that change as they get more interactive? Because right now, Webflow is essentially just serving static websites. So will that change as they get more interactive, as you start adding this membership functionality, all that stuff? Yeah. Joe, should we jump into WordPress strong? Let's do the pros and cons real quick of WordPress strong and where WordPress is weak. Webflow strong, Webflow's weak. And then I really want to get into the WordPress accessibility stuff because I know for our community, for web design in general, accessibility is a big deal. And so I want to talk about why that stuff matters. So let's go where WordPress is strong and where WordPress is weak. Joe, take it from the top.
Where WordPress is strong, legacy platform with tons of clout. If you're looking for how to do something in WordPress, there's very likely a lot of content around that or several solutions. It's huge. Anyone can build on it. It's an open platform. So naturally, there's a lot of communication about this. There's a lot of forums about this, a lot of content about this. Huge plugin marketplace and add-ons. As we know as Webflow users, you get to a point where you say, hey, I can't build this in here. I need to be an expert, a JavaScript expert to do this. I am not a JavaScript expert, and I can't do this without a plugin marketplace. So that's where WordPress really does come in strong. If I want an interactive map, a map with clickable dots on it, you're going to find a plugin that provides that for you. And then the e-commerce and membership sites, they've been doing this for a long time. Their marketplace has been open. There is a lot of opportunity for people to build these, and there's a lot of options for that. With Webflow, very limited right now. Ecosystem of page builders. There's good parts about that, and I think there's bad parts about that. The good part is you have a lot of options for how you can construct your page. Maybe I'm jumping ahead with the bad part, but the bad part is now there's so many different instances and types of ways to build a WordPress site. So this really breaks unity, in my opinion. And then the last one on the strong, robust CMS functionality, almost infinite. That is powerful. As we know, again, in Webflow, we can run into issues with this. With WordPress and the knowledge of how to do it, you can really build out anything in that CMS.
Yeah.
And Raymmar, the weak parts.
Yeah, I'll take the weaknesses.
Did I miss anything?
No, I think you're right. It is so powerful. Again, this goes back to it powers something like 65% of all websites that use a CMS on the internet, which makes up like 40% plus of all websites. It's big, right? So there's a lot of robustness there. Lots of developers. You go looking for web developers, you're going to find like a handful of WordPress web developers before you find the Webflow folks. There's just so many of them, right? Like everybody's brother, everybody in a marketing team, like, there's everybody knows how to open up WordPress, but also what does WordPress mean, right? So that's the first con in my mind is like, there's so many instances of it that what does it actually mean when you say WordPress? Do you mean you use this theme with that theme with this hosting and maybe you have a staging environment, but maybe you don't. And maybe you have this plugin, but maybe you don't. Do you have this form thing or maybe you have the other form thing? And do I know how to use all the different things together? And so like, because it's so big and because it's so extensible, it's difficult to know what WordPress actually means. So when someone says, hey, I know WordPress, I'm like, well, what does that actually, like, what do you know? right? When somebody says, I know Webflow, I know that they know how to build. I know they understand the CSS, how CSS works. I know they probably understand a little bit about the box model. I know they understand, page design and classes, global styles, things like this. Things you don't learn, you abstract all of that away with WordPress. And so that becomes a con, is like, what you don't know what you're getting when you get into a WordPress website. There's also backwards compatibility, huge backwards compatibility issues, which means WordPress started as a blogging platform, which means it's best at being a blogging platform. It's not the best at being a web building platform. They're trying to migrate or turn from a blogging platform into a web platform without screwing up all those websites. When you think about like 40% of the open web, there's probably hundreds of thousands, if not multiple millions, tens of millions of sites that are just built in WordPress and sitting there and haven't been touched for 8 years, 10 years, whatever, however long, right? And so they still count that as sites on WordPress. I would be interested to know what the numbers are of new sites. Like when people build new sites, forget about what existing web is it 40% of the web? How many percentage of total new sites are being built with one technology versus the other? If anybody out there has that data, I would love to know that. Because
Nice.
the backwards compatibility thing is a major issue with WordPress. It's why they can't just come out and build a new WYSIWYG editor. It's why they can't just come out and build something, and why Gutenberg created so many issues, because Gutenberg not only has to move working forward, but working backwards with all of the rest of the stuff. And that creates so much technical debt. If you know anything about building technical products, that creates like almost an insurmountable barrier. We talked about the community conflicts. There are conflicts with things like that Gutenberg editor, whatever. Maintenance and technical knowledge requirements. Obviously, this becomes a big issue. We always hear about the headaches when it comes to updating a WordPress site, having to worry about, is this plugin, blah, blah. Every time I logged in, you'd see 13 updates required, and any one of those could break the whole shebang, right? And that's always like a wild card when you're dealing with WordPress. And then accessibility, which we're going to dive into deep. I think we're probably going to go over an hour on this episode, but I really want to get to that accessibility component. Shout out to Jonathan Holden for sending me an article that I want to go through as part of this. But difficult data portability, WordPress was using short codes. This is one of the reasons why my website's still on WordPress versus having moved it in a blink to Webflow, because the way I had to build it, the way I built it using these different tools is just a nightmare, which means my data is not portable. I can't just export that data and then plug it into another database. I can't plug it into a Airtable. I can't plug it into an Excel sheet, a Google sheet, or whatever, right? Whereas with Webflow, I can. Right? All that data is semantic. It's structured in a modern format. It allows me to move that data wherever I want. So that's a major thing. It's hard to customize, right? It's very difficult unless I'm a technical person to customize something, even with those Oxygen builders, even with the theme builders, with the Elementors, etc. When I want to move the little button from being below the form to next to the form, I got to call a developer and they got to write some custom CSS, and maybe the theme file needs to be overwritten. So maybe I need a child theme, and it's like, what the fuck? I just want the button on the side. And then you have a conniption fit, and you move to Webflow. This is how it works.
Yeah.
And then you have unverified plugins. So you have things that, again, are out there that nobody's watching, looking at, understanding what they do, and you can install it because you're like, I want this functionality, and next thing you know, you just opened up a back door to everything on your website. And so those are all the pros and cons. Next, let's talk a little bit about Webflow strong and where Webflow's weak. Sorry, Joe, anything that I missed there? I just kind of went over. I went hard right there.
Let's go to Webflow is strong.
Real quick, this comment from Philip. Can you read that one, Joe?
As a traditional print designer, I can't express how bad I wanted to get into web design, but everything about WordPress turned me off. The only reason I'm into web design is because of my buttons are covering the rest.
So is because of Webflow, and then he follows up in the next one, point being that Webflow definitely lowers the barrier to entry for people who want to learn the craft.
Right. Absolutely. Webflow is now starting to create an army of web developers, novice web developers that are just learning the web, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, the core basics. And we're now seeing products be built from this. We're seeing communities be built from this, from the learning of the basic building blocks. So when a 20-year-old says, hey, I'm making websites on the side, I learned this Webflow platform in a few months, the next person is going to try it, and the next person is going to try it. And the barrier to entry in Webflow is just so much lower than WordPress. I think there was a point where that wasn't true, but now with the amount of content out there for Webflow, We're seeing people become pros very quickly. And to become pro level at WordPress, it requires years of experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like WordPress has become its own technical hurdle in and of itself. It's become so big and so crazy and so intense that like it's the antithesis of no code at a certain level. Sure, can you without code one-click install? You could set up a $3 hosting on like Bluehost or whatever the hell, $5 hosting, whatever. You can click WordPress install. You can go buy a theme for $20, $30. You use one of the free themes, whatever. You got a website. Okay. But if you want to build the stuff we're building in Webflow with the simplicity and ease that we're building it, the design, the speed, the performance, all of these things, to get that same result in WordPress, you need a monster team. You need a back-end engineer that understands the performance and how to speed up and accelerate your WordPress install. You need like a million layers of caching. You need front-end folks who can build the theme and customize the theme to do what you want specifically. It's just, there's multiple layers that you need. And so again, it's just not as easy to build some of these things. And I hate that we're not going to get too deep into that finite versus infinite game comparison here, because I think Webflow is playing more of an infinite game than Matt Mullenweg gives credit for, because they are opening this back end, because they are opening these tools, because the goal is to build a legacy business. They could have sold and cashed out on this thing a long time ago. I don't know Vlad super personally, but I know him enough to have talked with him personally about some of this stuff, to talk to him in groups, to see and listen to all his podcasts. Like, I understand what his vision for this company is. And his vision for this company is not to win, right? He's not out here wanting to win web development. He wants to do exactly what Philip is saying here, lower the barrier to entry for so many people to get into this game. This is why I think a conversation between he and Matt Mullenweg would be so exciting, because they're both kind of on that mission to democratize or decentralize building for the web. And so, yeah, they're going about it in different ways, but fuck, it's so similar. All right, let's go back here real quick. We're going to run through Webflow's strong, Webflow's weak, because we all kind of know this. Obviously, the performance, we've talked about that, ease of design, there's no maintenance. The community's amazing. This is why I picked this is like one of the things that stuck out for me in Webflow. This is why I picked WordPress years ago, because their community was super strong. Don't get this wrong, though. The community built WordPress. WordPress didn't build WordPress. The community built WordPress. And this community will also build Webflow if Webflow lets it. If Webflow allows this community to build it and kind of empowers that, which I think they are. That's why they're so this is so exciting, because the community is just a big push in that momentum. Squarespace doesn't have this community. Wix doesn't have this community. None of these other platforms have this. Bubble doesn't have this community. Webflow has a crazy community that's going to take it to the next level. Clonable designs, we talked about that and how I think they're open sourcing design. We mentioned that last year. You can export the code. Their interactions engine's amazing. Building data and binding templates, or binding data and building templates, like all that stuff is a pro. Where they're weak, and we all know this, e-commerce and membership sites, they're working on that. Large CMSs, 10,000 items plus. Again, I think that has to do with the infrastructure. I think they're fixing that with the rest of it too. Your hosting is locked in. This is the biggest thing forever and always. This is where that closed versus open source thing comes in. This is the one that anybody on WordPress will always come back to and say, that's the trump card. That's why we can't use it. This is why. And so that's the decision you have to make, right? Is you're locked in at a certain level. Obviously, Webflow doesn't have plugins, and their pricing is confusing, although I think they're working on that, and we should see some new updates on that pretty soon. So any thoughts on that? I know we ran through the Webflow stuff, but I'm assuming our audience is fairly up to date on pros and cons on Webflow.
Yeah, let's get into the accessibility comment here.
This is the big one.
You shared this with me earlier today. Tell me about it.
Yeah, Jonathan Holden. Shout out to Jonathan, who is probably in the audience. So shout out to him if he's watching now or in the future. But Gutenberg, accessibility costs, WordPress, the W3C work. If you don't know who W3C is, they're the people who set the standards for how the web, for the web, right? And so they were looking for a CMS, and they ended up going with Craft CMS as opposed to WordPress. And they cited accessibility as their biggest concern. Specifically, one of the responses was, more importantly, Gutenberg itself was not truly open source in the process. Automattic drove it as a business decision based on Wix, Weebly, et cetera, Squarespace. And so there's huge, and if you read this article, it talks about WP Tavern took issue with something, and this company said this, and it's a lot of he said, these, she said, whatever. But the root of the matter is that the company, if you go back to the state of the word address that we showed last week, the little snippet, and you watch the whole thing, Matt Mullenweg continued to talk throughout the whole presentation about how Gutenberg is the future. They want Gutenberg to be the open source standard for how you build on the web. They want, all this to become this whole thing. But even the company who sets the standards for the web said we can't use WordPress as a CMS because in and of itself, it is not accessible, right? Accessibility is a huge buzzword, but it's also important to the future of the web. And so this, to me, becomes a major issue, right? To have these, to have the company that sets the standards for the web say, we can't use your CMS because it doesn't fit, and they used a closed source platform, right? Part of WP Tavern argument was that the selection of Craft CMS is not open source software, though WordPress itself, okay, and then it talks about how, again, it makes some of the arguments I do that WordPress in practice is open source, but in principle is not really, right? In the course of being implemented, it's not always. So Joe, thoughts on accessibility here on this? I recommend people read this article. There's some good updates here. It talks a little bit about this. I can share this in the comments here for anybody who might want to read it. You just did. Yeah.
I just shared it. Yeah, I shared it. This was really surprising to read. I truly believe that accessibility is not going to be something you can avoid in the near future. Right now, I think companies can still avoid it. And what I mean by avoiding is just not putting priority to it, that we're building for the web and we don't care about accessibility. I think this can happen for a little bit longer, but in a short period of time, 1, 2, 5 years, it will not be avoidable. This will not be an option. This will almost feel like a requirement for web building. And seeing a company like WC3 dropping a CMS because of the accessibility requirements, this is just another flashing light for me saying this is true. Accessibility is not going to be something we can avoid. And in that article, it states that WC3 really wanted to stay open source. They wanted to continue with open source, but this requirement was so big they needed to go with the company that took these practices into consideration. So very interesting read. I do recommend you check it out. That is, send that to your clients when they're looking for a web project and they say, well, why do I choose Webflow over WordPress? It's a great read.
Yeah. And this goes back to the backwards compatibility stuff. We're in a modern world of web design. And WordPress is not a modern web design solution. WordPress is making its best effort to stay modern in a world as things change. But this is why, this is one of the reasons, the same issue is why we watch all the new movies on Netflix streaming servers and not Blockbuster, right? Because at one time, Blockbuster was WordPress. And at one time, they had it all figured out, and they knew that people were still going to come to the office, to rent their damn movies. That they didn't want to deal with this online thing. They didn't want to have to get DVDs back and forth, and that wasn't going to take off. And Netflix said, you know what? We know there's something a little bit different here. And I bet they use different technology in the back end. And there were points where people were like, and we hear about these instances all the time where something new comes and the thing that was old is just the established way. And people were like, this is how we do it. This is the best way. Maybe for you. But a lot of us are starting to see that there's new ways, right? A lot of us are starting to see that there's these beautiful cars that are being put on the road, and some people are driving horse and buggies, and we're like, well, maybe we don't want to be in the horse and buggy anymore. Maybe we want to be over here in the Ferrari. We want to be over here in the race car. And maybe that means it's going to be like beholden to Ferrari to always have the race car at a certain level. But sometimes you want to go fast. And to go fast, you need that tool. And so I don't know. There's like this would be interesting if anybody's watching out there and knows WordPress people, knows somebody who's open for a debate. I've been out of that world for 3 or 4 years now, but I would love to host a proper, conversation about this with somebody in that WordPress world, and not I don't want this to be contentious. This doesn't need to be a us versus them thing. Same thing with the Mullenweg and Vlad conversation. There's so much common ground here. It would just be interesting to dissect the approach and to understand the mentality here. Joe, any thoughts on that? Just as we close the show here.
Yeah, I had the thought of what I said last week about how we're changing as a society and how we want things to be done easier, how we want less effort. Instead of going out to eat, now we order our food on an app and we don't leave our house. This is a societal change in how we think about things, if something requires too many steps or too much effort, we may not want to do it. We want the easiest approach for a lot of tasks in our day. And I'm just thinking about that in Webflow versus WordPress. That WordPress requires all these steps. You get some benefits from all these steps. But at the end of the day, you're spending a lot of time on it. Where Webflow, I can achieve a very similar end product in many use cases with just a different platform with a little bit more money. So yeah, I thought about that. I still really believe truly that's something that's changing in society. And I think the open and closed is going to follow that type of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree with all that. Well said. Okay. So any other comments, thoughts, anything in here we should address before we walk away? Let's go back. Webflow weakness funnels. I think if you know a little bit about building funnels and conversions with some G tags, you could do a little bit of that. I mean, WordPress is not any easier for funnels in my mind than Webflow is. I'd be interested to know what you mean by that. Conniption fit. Thought that was a phrase made up by my family. Raymmar, you're my long lost brother. Yeah, I don't know where that came from. It just it came out during the rant, you know. Building with short codes, then going through the short codes now. It's so hard, man. Like, and it was cool. I remember when I learned about short codes, I was like, yeah, I'm like learning how to code. Nope. I'm just creating technical debt. Let's see. Anything else you're seeing in there? Let's see. Joel Whitaker. There are security benefits to open source projects. One thing Webflow could do is launch a bug bounty program similar to Airtable and Shopify. Yeah. Yes. I'd be surprised if they don't do something like that. I know that's pretty common with a lot of tech companies. Kayla saying, never use WordPress because it seems so complicated. I came from Wix and was so frustrated with all the limitations, so Webflow was a godsend.
Nice.
Yeah.
You know, and also really understand that there are different types of people out there that we see some people commenting saying WordPress is very difficult. And then we see some people that really want to completely abstract HTML and CSS and not touch Webflow. So really, when you're thinking about this topic, also consider how different people think, how different people learn, and how different people act.
Yeah. Yeah. You want to read this one?
I tried learning WordPress so many times before Webflow. I could never figure out how to get past my site looking like a damn blog, no matter how many themes I applied.
and
yeah.
Then he follows up with.
Meanwhile, it took my teen cousins barely 3 days to learn Webflow and by themselves after seeing me work on it. There we go. And that is an amazing comment, an amazing statement. Aditya is an employee of Finsweet. He started from very little knowledge, maybe 1 year ago, maybe a little bit more. And now he is working with some of our largest clients on enterprise level builds. The knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is going to enhance anything that you do as a web developer. And, you know, maybe you know that in WordPress, and that's very valuable. But if you don't know that in WordPress, you're just making a lot of things more difficult. So yeah, Aditya, thanks for sharing. Huge progress as a Webflow developer.
Yep. Pete Thompson saying, what do you mean by locked in hosting? What about exporting code, then hosting with something like Netlify's continuous deployment? You can do this for $0. Sure. If you just want static pages, if you're just looking for static sites, correct. It's when you're looking for the dynamic data, when you're looking to bind data to templates, when you're looking to use functionality like symbols and, you know, like modify your interactions after you export that code and update it to the Netlify site. Like that's where there's some complexity here. Craft CMS is written in Twig, an interface between the CMS and PHP, and you can't use PHP directly. Everything extra needs to be built as a plugin. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about Craft. because this comes back to, and I don't want to go too deep on this because I think this is like a subject for its own time. But it goes back to that front end as a service thing, right? I think the decision will be eventually tools like Webflow will allow you to pull in any modern data set and just build a front end for it. That's what the plugins in Webflow will be. In addition to like functionality, and like I think they're gonna figure out ways to let you, just like you integrate like a Airtable with a Zapier, you know, you'll be able to integrate a HubSpot with a Webflow. And you'll be able to take the data from HubSpot and manipulate that in Webflow and maybe bind it as a list like you do with your CMS data. Who knows, right? And so like this is where I think that front end as a service is coming, and we'll see a lot more uses for like, and maybe the framework again will be proprietary, but the solutions and how it will allow people to build software and build scalable systems for small groups will change everything. And I think that's not to be overlooked. That's the infinite game that Webflow is playing here in my mind, in contrast to, you know, what Mullenweg might be saying there. So let's see. Yeah, for building landing pages, better Webflow. Let's see. Challenge idea: rebuild Raymmar's WordPress site. If somebody out there wants to jump in that mix with me, I'm in. Let's play. That's been on my to-do list for like, that's since 2018. So since I started learning Webflow, my goal was to like get good enough with Webflow to build something. And if you look in my clonables, I have like a couple instances of things that I tried and I was experimenting and playing with it. And then I never actually like got all the way around to it. Then I joined Finsweet and I was like, well, whatever, I guess we'll leave that. And like, I don't know, at some point it'll happen. Just don't set a clock yet.
You know, we hear that a lot from our clients. You know, what you have is a personal site. You don't have any really specific reason to move it over to Webflow immediately. But companies do. Companies need to access their site. And we're seeing a lot more clients come in saying, hey, we have a WordPress build and we can't properly manage it. We're no longer working with the team that managed it. Or we have decided we don't want our developers working on marketing. This is a new trend. So we're seeing this. This is not just Raymmar's site being built in WordPress. This is happening to companies, and that's what companies are coming to Finsweet for. Help take us out of WordPress and into this new Webflow environment that we can really take advantage of. And just the other day, a family friend reached out about their WordPress site. I didn't jump into the WordPress instance. I will not do it, but I just loaded the site. Thousands of articles, a login portal, synced calendar invites. All of this was built by her 3 kids and her husband over the past 6-7 years. And I told her, you either need a super WordPress pro to edit this, or you need to completely rebuild your site from scratch and, you know, just start fresh. You know, bring your data in, but really start from a fresh build. It's impossible to migrate that type of project without the expert level skills. And Raymmar, you're seeing that in your personal site. We're seeing that in company sites, and they're not looking to rebuild in WordPress. That's why in the beginning, when you said, I want to see the stat of new websites built this year, that's the stat I'm looking for too, because I bet we're seeing trends in that over the past few years, and we'll continue to see trends over the next few.
Yeah, I agree. And there were some more contradictions I might do once I read the whole episode. I'm thinking about starting like a little hangout, like live stream thing where we just talk about random shit that's not like wholly tied to Webflow. And part of that, you know, maybe we can discuss things like that book and other folks can read it and we can have like conversations about that, the philosophy of some of these things, because there's so much to get into there where I think there were instances where I was listening to parts of that book and I was like, oh, well, this sounds like WordPress kind of has the advantage in some of this. And now it sounds like Webflow has the advantage. And it would just be good to, after reading that, dissect it with some other folks. And Matt, if you're watching this, you watched the last one, I know, because you left some comments. I know you watched pieces of it. Maybe you didn't watch the whole thing. Maybe you watched it on 2x speed. But Vlad or Matt Mullenweg, if y'all are watching this in the future, let's figure out how to have this talk. I think it'd be amazing. The future of the web depends on the work that both of y'all are doing, along with all the work that people watching this are doing. If you're out there building for the web, I would encourage you to just keep building. Whatever tool you're using, keep building, keep pushing, and don't be scared to learn something new. This is something I need to keep myself in check with as well. It's like, as new things come on, I'm always looking, I'm always scoping, I'm always exploring to see what else is out there. So, you know, don't stay blinded by one or the other. If you're, you know, in Webflow, don't be surprised if you see some real competition over the next couple of years, right? That doesn't mean you all have to switch. That doesn't mean the business model has to change, but it's going to get more competitive. And if you're in WordPress over there and you're just saying, this is the way I've always done it, I've done it for the last 10 or 15 years, and it's the best platform because it's open source, this, that, the other, don't get locked into that and find yourself on the outside looking in 2 years or 3 years, right? And so we could be wrong. You know, I could be wrong about all this. We could be watching this in 2 years and Webflow sold to Adobe and now it's only enterprise and we're all fucked. And, you know, like, but I don't think that's happening. I don't think that's going to happen. So,
no. Nice.
All right.
Yeah, that's a great closing comment.
Yep.
Anything else?
That's it. I think
great.
The last
Great
thing
stream.
to do would be to just tell everyone to like the video, share it with a friend. Yep. Send this to somebody you know who builds with WordPress. Tell them to share their thoughts. We'd love to like start just hearing a little bit more from that community. It'd be cool to maybe have a guest on from WordPress. You know, we did that in the past. We did like a WordPress versus Webflow debate. I'd love to handle that side of the debate now. I'd love to go head to head with somebody on the WordPress side and just talk and explore this. So if you're out there, let's do it. Otherwise, we'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.